Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt and this is Cutting Through the Matrix on the 2nd of August 2020. As usual, I hope you're all doing okay under these incredible times in which we exist. I get lots of feedback from people who email me and tell me about their conditions in their countries and so on. And you always get a little taste of what's to come across the whole planet eventually, because you can't lock down a planet, a good chunk of the planet, and literally stop almost all commerce. Pretty well forbid people to work, and then wonder why you're starting to get a shortage of food, you know. And South Africa, some articles there actually were sent to me, where they don't have much to start to live on anyway to begin with, but they're already had people dying of starvation, yeah. And that's going to happen elsewhere pretty rapidly, because you're living through an amazing time of a planned agenda by a truly global government that really exists. If you don't understand that, really, what you see on television or the clips on your internet, what you're seeing, they're not the bosses. They're a higher management level above politics, obviously. But they're not the bosses for the whole planet here. But the whole planet's on board with it, you see. And of course they do have these setups, these World Health Organizations as an example, through the United Nations. And the WHO is pretty well 3/4 funded, at least 3/4 by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So you can scrub that out for anything that's factual or scientific. Gates has an incredible agenda because his daddy was involved in the same kind of things, and eugenics, etc. So, you know, sinister characters definitely, but they're not the bosses. The old system of having bosses at the very, very top, or the fact that the bosses don't work as such. They comment occasionally, but they don't take the heat for what their decisions cause on the general populations ever, down through time actually. And they have the bee. One of their symbols is the bee, of course. And the structure of the beehive, that's a Royal Society. The very first thing they brought out at Royal Society, it was a glass pyramid. Inside it was a beehive to represent the perfect society which they would structure through sciences. Most folk think it's just some kind of independent scientific club just for chit-chat and sharing ideas. It's beyond that. They're all selective Masons initially, and powerful people through finance and so on. But they also wanted to direct society and shape the course of the destiny of societies across the world. Very selective, in fact, for a long time, who their members would be. And it wasn't something you could just ask to join. And that's how the world really is run. But the perfect society was basically modeled on the beehive idea. Napoleon had the same thing too, a very high Mason too. And you all know probably, if you've read in the documentation about him, he went into when he went into Egypt, of course, with a big army which he left behind primarily, and left them all to take the heat. But the fact is, he went into the Great Pyramid in Giza, and he was in for quite a while, and he came out with his. This was a big thing with top Masons at the time. If you just lay in a sarcophagus, and you get this instant revelation and so on, and be a different person. And he made a cloak, had a cloak made for him, and they used some of the golden bees that had been taken out of one of that's one of the graves actually in Egypt, to represent the perfect society again. So here is a guy whose war across a good part of Europe, and and even into Russia, it was intended to unify Europe. Interesting, it's almost the same kind of thing. Unify, isn't it? You unify Europe. And people like himself would be the magicians behind it. You see, the real rulers, the natural rulers, with little help from their friends. And so he had his cloak made with these bees all around the cloak. You keep getting, you live in a world of symbology, and most folk don't quite get what they see. And the signs and the gestures you get on pretty well everything you'll see from people who work in mid-management levels on television, representing organizations that claim they run the world. But you're loaded everywhere you look with these signs and their symbols, of course. And the folk just don't get it, do they? Because it's so common, it's everyday occurrences. And yeah, they go ooh and ah when they look into the Super Bowl and things like that, and they watch these occultic ceremonies. They're not made by the dancers. You know, the dancers literally do what they're told to, well paid, promotions and all that. But you'll see all the occultic symbology displayed every time you look at this thing, and basically the transitioning of society and humans themselves into other beings, always under the guise of progressive science and so on, progressive knowledge, and the implementation of progressive knowledge. It's quite something you watch, but it's boring as well, to me anyway, because you know what it all represents, is meant to represent, and it's really not high messaging for the public. But you'll see all these things all the time, over and over and over, and it does get boring. It really does. You're living in a world completely different than the one that exists, because you've been trained to see it differently from birth. And Jack C. Lowell, really good philosopher, talked about that, the idea of propaganda, and how it truly works, and how you have to train a child very early for subsequent propaganda to take effect on them. And he said the initial technique of indoctrinating a child to listen and just accept was so important. If it didn't get that initial indoctrination, subsequent indoctrination wouldn't take on them as they got older. It wouldn't work. So that was always understood from a very early time, because there's nothing new in controlling millions or even billions of people. These are very old sciences indeed, and there's never been a time when all of these sciences are really interconnected now, specialized segments of them, to do with the mind and humanity and sociology and anthropology, etc. It's all combined today, and it's so much so that even the military, especially the US and the Chinese militaries, they take anthropologists along with them when they go into other countries, either to take the countries down or to help them, which is the same thing. They take them down by big smiling faces, and then they dish out cash, and then they manage you, and they give you little hospitals and schools, then they get involved in education, and before you know it, they've turned it into another little indoctrination school for themselves to manage the peasantry better. These are well understood, and most folk really don't know. They really haven't a clue. So many of the big, massive charities you look at are not there for the reasons that you think that they're part of, really, the military-industrial complex, a lot of them. And that's why there's no real check on where the cash goes, except occasional expose of millions disappearing here and there and everywhere, etc. But whenever you hear charity, it's like mum's apple pie, because you've been trained that way. And if you were to complain about mum's apple pie, you must be a terribly bad person. Yeah? USAID, for instance, and these helpful humanistic foundations, and so they're part of it. They dish out the cash and some of the training in some of these countries. They want to take over for resources, and that's how things are. War is seldom anything. Well, we don't go to war to help people. We don't go to war to even free people. We go to war to take over the resources of nations. And you don't get any of it. You'll do all the fighting, you get handed the bill for it, and you'll be given simple propaganda, total lies of why you're doing it. But the ones behind you who already own your country, and I mean own, are the ones who get all the profits from all the raw resources and so on that come along. And that's the real world. It's vastly, vastly different, as I say, from the one that you're given. The US, for a little while, a short period, had some hope. Newborn countries have some hope when they're still riding on the backs of what they thought was a revolution to give them individual rights and freedoms. Very important, on individual, you see. And basic rights to property and things like that, which they really didn't. Nothing was safe in Europe if you're lower people and lower levels of the class system. Nothing was safe at all that you had. Even the farming, we saw that even in Russia, where small plot farmers that still kept the country going collectively. When you put them all together, what they produced, it kept the country going. There were small independent families and so on. Were pretty well wiped out and starved to death when the Bolsheviks took over. And they lost everything. And then the state pretended to take it over and run all. But there's nothing, as I say, that's presented to you that's exactly as I said it is. With the American idea, yes, you got all the crooks running into the States as soon as they heard, you can exploit this country, there's so little, and it's true, so few laws and regulations at the time in the early days. And it's also understood and taught, of course, in sociology that the reason that the US is sinking now is it caught up and surpassed the bureaucracies with massive civil services and government agencies and state agencies who all implement stacks and stacks of rules and until you can't afford to do anything and start to prosper. That was all done intentionally too. So corruption always sets in, but for a while there was an optimism in the US, and it also seeped in to the individuals in the US, regardless of class, because they were left alone for a while. You didn't have to pay taxes. I mentioned that before, that taxes came in really to help to start off. They called it the temporary war tax, or the victory tax in America. And that was taxing your income. And then back in the 90s, I gave talks on the history of the income tax in America and elsewhere. And Effie had Effie on too, and she's an elderly woman who'd lived through the Great Depression. She said how bad it was. They were a little plot farm themselves, like many folk in America. The US at one time, and this is what Jefferson said too, would only remain free if everybody had the ability to feed themselves, even one cow or so, and a little field or whatever to grow their food. He said once that was taken away from people, you were under some kind of tyranny, and he was quite right on it too. So these are basic things for life. Now they give you the idea of massive profits if you get away from all of that and go into the high business and all of that kind of stuff. But when things crash, you're back to square one again. Now how are you going to feed yourself? And so on. And apart from that, as I said, the sharks ran into America like you wouldn't believe, from all over the world, and the scam artists, the chronologists. And I gave talks on chronology years ago, and it's the art of the great con, and how it works, and how you must participate in your own fraud, basically. You're getting defrauded or you're getting robbed without knowing it. But you must, it's like The Sting, the movie The Sting, things like that. You must participate in being fooled, and you go along with it. That's the same as voting. You actually, most folk who vote really think they're going to change something. As I've said before, if voting was real, which it would be if you had a real society and people were real and politicians were real and they meant what they said and they had the best interest of the public at heart, then yeah, it certainly would. But if it ever was real, it was gone long, long ago. And Carol Quigley mentioned that in Tragedy and Hope, his book. And he was a member of the society that at least was a recruiting agency for the management of the US on behalf of those who really ruled it. And he said that every president, and even prime ministers across the world, in different certain countries, had been part of chosen and pre-selected by the organizations, regardless of party, before they get into office. This one organization with its own tenets and goals and ideals and so on. And he was no conspiracy nut. I mean, he taught university. He also taught at wasn't this Georgetown University. He taught stacks and stacks of bureaucrats and people who would work in the Foreign Office for the U.S. State Department and so on, and across the world as diplomats. So he was up there. He knew what he was talking about. And well, that's again a sideline again too. I could go on forever about him, but what I'm saying is the US was taken over pretty quickly. Once you got to World War I, they'd already had techniques, you have bumps in the road as you're being trained to need something. I've mentioned predictive programming before over the years, and it's a common usage now. But what they do is they give you events and entertainment too, of course. Most of your entertainment is loaded with predictive programming, how you should feel about this and feel about that and think about this and etc. And what you should like or what you should condemn. It's all full of that and how you should be. And you lap it up, never realizing you're getting brainwashed. And you wonder where your opinions came from, maybe as you get a bit older. Hopefully you will. But predictive programming, it also comes out from newspapers, which of course the elite have always owned. You must get uniformity of information, and which gives uniformity of opinion. So then it's easy to control people when they all have the same opinions because you've given it to them. And so they always give you a right-wing paper in every place, every area, and a left-wing paper. It's generally a sun or it's a star. You see, one or the other, or a Mercury and so on. But it's always one or the other that they give you, and folk will pick it. Well, my dad read that, so I'll read this one and I'll vote that way too. Very easy, very simple. And of course, the talks that they gave years ago at the Rockefeller Institute, basically, when they were taking over all the industry of the U.S. through different sub-companies and so on. They decided to how many newspapers would need, and other ones that spun off from the Rockefellers did the same kind of thing. But initially they said about 30 odd, maybe 32, 33 newspapers across the country, and magazines. And I think Quigley touched on that too. He said that even for the civil service, they had magazines. That would be very flashy, glossy magazines for women and men, you see, in the civil service. And that would cater to them and give them their ideas and what they should think about events and so on. Everybody's catered to, very much so. And so you really don't have true free opinions. And generally, when you're not under stress, you'll never realize that you're getting it's not forced opinion, it's a uniformity of opinion. It's selected and mandated. They put across articles that all seem to be from this author or that author, and so it must be all independent, and it's just coincidence that they're all agreeing about the same things, and everywhere you look, to read. That's how it's done. And of course, once movies came in, that took over and loaded the deck with propaganda. But with predictive programming, you can also get events, because it's like the vaccine. It's like COVID, the great pandemic, as they say. It's very much like that. In fact, to actually say that, I've read articles before from the SAGE group and so on, and the subgroups hired by the UK of behaviourists and the BIT groups and so on, the nudge experts, you might say, who actually gave out handouts to the newspapers to tell them how to present news to the public in this so-called pandemic, and how to the different stages of it, how to start it off and put fear into the public. And if they found not enough folk were complying and obeying what they were told to do, then they could hype up the fear. So in other words, terrify the public. That was the advice given by the government, say the agencies, through these particular behavioural and psychological groups they were using for brainwashing us all. It's long ago, yeah. Terrify the public, literally cause terror amongst the public to get compliance. Well, again, predictive programming back in the 19th century, the characters who came in, we know who some of them were, entered the US, were quite open about the fact that they'd love to get a centralized system for the economy and run it and own it, of course. And so there's about three bankers, or put this way, some of them are bankers and some of them also lent money to nations, in fact, even back then. Got together, and long before Jekyll Island came along, and gave these little predictive programming stunts, you see, to get the public to demand something. And so it caused crashes. So three of them got together, and they caused the crashes in the late 1800s, two of them at least. And I know that Gould was one of them, and I think J.P. Morgan might be another. But they got to get just like a Soros operation. These are old techniques where Soros boasted in the British newspapers how he'd crashed basically the British economy at one point. And he said he called up two of his friends and they arranged it together, and they did it and got away with it. No one arrests them because they're way above any. They're up there. They're working for the real owners of the planet, you see. And he boasted about it quite happily of how they did it. And as I said, the country had to borrow millions and millions of pounds to try to float the economy again. They screw folk over and over and over, these characters, with impunity. Yeah, complete, just like the 2008 crash, complete impunity. It's incredible. But anyway, back to the late 1800s. And so the idea was to get the public to say, oh, look, we can't go on like this with different banks having their own cash and some of them with their own currency even, but we can't go on. We need a centralized system. And so you must always, just like the vaccine thing, get the public to be terrified and demand it. Get them to demand what you want them to demand. And then you say, well, it just happens. This so happens we have a plan, you see. And so same thing happened in time for World War I, where they brought in the income tax to fund the same guys who, under President Wilson, they brought in the Federal Reserve System. And they also brought in the income tax in 1917 or so to fund the money, to pay back the money that would get borrowed by the government for the war when they were going to get involved with it. Part of the reason they got into in the US was to make sure that the countries they'd been lending to from the US across Europe would be able to pay it all back. This is what it's all about, folks. The US didn't go to World War I for altruistic reasons. It was to make sure that all the loans were secured, and with the Treaty of Paris they came out with eventually, after the big conference that they had in 1919, they gave a bunch of the characters who were the moneylenders themselves, or representatives of them, the power to decide who was going to pay what, to pay back all the loans for the war. They dumped a lot in Germany, of course, completely unable to pay it all back, so that helped to lead to World War II. That's a different story again. But the point is, they always get the public to demand what they want you to demand. I say, what's that you say? We demand you centralize the money system and make it, because it's so corrupt, and it keeps folding all the time, and we go bankrupt. And really, well, I don't know if we can do that for you. Well, maybe we could set up an institution, maybe, and so they set up the private banking system called the Federal Reserve. It sounds awfully important, eh? And yet it's really a foreign bank, in a sense, or a series of them, often employing foreigners to run this system for the American citizenry. It's astonishing, really. But it's no different than what ran Britain for centuries and still does in the City of London. So, as I say, predictive programming is awfully important to get the public to literally to demand what they want you to demand. Save us, that's the cry, you see. We can't go on like this. And, okay, but there's conditions here. We can help float the economy again, but you have to a tax system is going to get brought in to pay off the money that you're going to be borrowing from us. And of course, that's usury. And usury at one time for labour was completely illegal. And that was hashed out in Wilson's time when they tried to bring it in for World War One. The actual paying of income taxes, because labouring, getting paid, taxation of labour was illegal. That had been the way for centuries, actually, in different countries. Mind you, they can always get it from 100 different other ways, through fees, they call it fees. Your countries now are loaded up with fees for this and fees for that, and licensing for this, and lots of licenses and fees. So it's a distaxation, of course. And if you pay your fee, in other words, it's like a license, for a driving license. You get fined and charged, maybe put in prison if you don't have a license to drive. If you pay money and you get a license, then it's okay to do something that's otherwise illegal. That's the difference. You've paid money, now you can legally drive. And many other things are very similar to that too. So yeah, the US at one time was vivacious to an extent. As life, had a lot of life in it. Canada had that at one time too. I think it was dying off with Pierre Trudeau, because he brought in massive international socialism, because he was beyond just socialism. But up until the 1970s, the US and Canada were the places to be, because even the working class too still had this idea of optimism. But in the late 70s it started to die off, and as economies were stagnating, and again the big corporations were putting factories now across the world, different cheaper labour area markets, of course. And then of course they'd start to inflate the currency, and in the process they devalue the purchasing power, so you need more and more paper to pay for the same amount of goods, until you're running backwards. And we've been like that for an awful long time. That was all intentional, because I've never ever you understand, the system that runs us all is not for us. It's not for us. It never was. The chronologists who run the banking industry, the true international banking industry at the top, and the World Bank, for instance, and the IMF, and the Bank for International Settlements, were all constructs of what were set up, but really globalists. They were for world enterprise, for real, true world federalism, as long as they ruled all, you see. And so that goes into, you can go into Carl Quigley again to get your ideas and roots from that one. Empire was the idea, world empire. Hasn't changed. And you will find out that the Great Reset they're talking about is the culmination for this time in history, to bring it all into full worldwide effect, with themselves again at the top running the whole show, with a massive global bureaucracy of civil servants, and many of them are private corporate civil servants, but they're just the same. Some big corporations have more civil servants working for them for their own corporation than some governments do. It's not uncommon. And you look at the World Economic Forum itself, and look how many employees they have, thousands and thousands of them. And they have whole departments for educating their future leaders across the world. And really, they're sort of like political social leaders that will keep you going with the idea they've got democracy, but in reality, that they're trained by those who already rule the world. And the world is ruled. But yes, as I say, it's an awful shame. You can see it in the old movies too, before they were totally contaminated and loaded. Because in the old movies, and some of them were silly comedies and so on, but silly and happy at the same time. There's that optimism. It's all gone now. It's all gone completely. And and that was and Canada's even worse, because Canada's was socialistic long ago, was taken over long ago for socialism. And even when Guzenko wrote his book on about the fall of a Titan, to do with the fact of the civil servant, that the federal civil service in Canada being loaded with card-carrying communists at the time, at the end of World War II, that didn't die off or go away by any means at all. So Canada was heavily loaded with this whole idea of socialism. And socialism too means many different things to different people. It's meant to be that way. The people at the bottom think socialism is going to be more fair, and especially when you're in the middle class, or lower middle class, or working classes. You think, I've got a safety net there. If I ever need a safety net, this socialism will take care of me. No, it's not. It's so-called a social science of how to run the world, how to run collectivist societies, and how to make them efficient, very efficient. That's the idea, right down to getting both partners out, if they have any partners at all, both out working in the workforce, and is a stage to dissolution totally of the family unit, of course, and you get a new type of family unit, which will be supplied by the state, which has already happened to an extent. And science pops in, and we're taking that over too, you see. It all comes together. However, socialism had a lot of followers in the 1930s and 40s and 50s even, because it still gave the preaching, deceptive preaching, we're here for ordinary folk, and to give you safety nets if you got unemployed and things like that. But the science way above it was declared in the early 20th century, openly, by the Fabian Society, if you care to look into it. And George Bernard Shaw, he said that the working man, for instance, thinks that he's going to get more income to take home to his family, and more guaranteed income, where he can look ahead and maybe purchase more items, or even if you, the Fabians didn't want you to own property. They wanted the state to own the property. The state, of course, like everything else, farms it out to private corporations, big corporations. You know? And so you can bring in the same thing. But you say, well, it can't be socialism, because there's big chains of corporate owners now in real estate that rent out across the world, and they do have that. But no, it's the same folk that brought you Fabianism, so they could have almost total ownership across big cities of vast swaths of property. You'll never get your head round it. The folk who manage money, it's almost genetic with them. They're obsessed with how to make more all the time, and how to get round ways of other obstacles that are put in their path with optimism. They're very optimistic, but they're obsessed with money all the time. But the ones who are above them, they have all the money. They have all the money. They'll never go bust. The ones above them all, and that's the key to it. Everyone gets stuck in their own level of indoctrination, and most of them never figure out their entire lives that they're under this kind of system. You look at the different gangsters that run big cons on society, and they're often, I can remember Bernie Madoff, when the 2007-8 collapse happened, and his massive Ponzi scheme came down. But there were articles out there how everybody knew him in the big city, the Big Apple and all that, and how your doors literally opened for him, like servants almost bowing to the guy, and he didn't have to open doors and so on, like he was, and that's how these characters live. And it was a castle in the air. As long as folk kept coming in to invest money, they could keep the con going longer and longer, but not forever. And eventually it fell. But so they love this kind of feeling of supremacy over others, And unfortunately, the problem with most folk, the ordinary folk at the bottom too, that like doormen in hotels, they will grovel to characters who have this kind of cash. It's a sad thing, isn't it? People often say, and the communists will tell you that, even the Antifa groups now, all these people just kowtowing to people who have in statues who had all this cash and power. Well, nobody forced them to kowtow, you see. It's unfortunately in human nature. Just like the Antifa communists would kowtow to a reincarnation of Lenin today, or Trotsky. And they would, immediately, they grovel here, that's a god in earth, you see. It's the same with the Rockefellers, when old Rockefeller had the military or the militia turn on the miner strikers in the tent cities at one time. And they opened fire on these tents and wiped out a lot of the miners and their families. That's when they brought in the idea of, let's turn him into a do-gooder. He's not a mean, terrible rubber baron type character. No, he wants to help society and make it better for you see. So they created very quickly, and it all shows you using the Bernays type characters, who understood human nature awfully well. The idea of propaganda again, and reinvent Rockefeller as a philanthropist. And once they did that, they could take over so many massive businesses and big pharma groups. We're here to help you. We're here to help you. And I remember that it was a book called The Rockefellers, I think, and it mentions that not long after the shooting, when they very quickly set up this big philanthropy, using public relations experts at that time, in that day and age. It was already well advanced, obviously. One of them was called Gates, by the way, and the other one was Mackenzie King of Canada. They made him a prime minister eventually as a reward. But so they reinvented Rockefeller as a great philanthropist. And they said that for one big PR stunt, they brought around miners' homes, or their shacks, really. And they said they all knew it was done, and all the cameras were there, and they all knew it was being done for public relations. But as soon as you got in the doors of some of the miners, they could see them slumping, almost bowing, literally looking down in the presence of someone who was it was kind of disgusting and shameful and sad. Sad statement about humanity. Not long after, the guy had literally told militias to wipe out families like that. But that's how you do it. If you understand human nature, again, back to Plato, you know the formulas, and you can reproduce the same systems if you understand the sequence of introduction and implementation. Sad, isn't it? Very sad. And I've always said it's not a good thing to worship people, human living people. It's not a good thing. You'll always end up in disaster. But the sad thing is, most folk, and especially in an atheistic society, that's why they had to destroy religions, because in a totally atheistic society, they'll worship humans. And they'll create them for you. So-and-so is a genius. This man is a multi-billion-dollar genius. And it's all fake and all that. But you'll believe it, and many of them will grovel, absolute grovel, to get near these people. Like they're magically, powerful magic. Very similar to kings and queens in the Middle Ages and even later Middle Ages. And it wasn't unusual in England too, for people to try and touch the cloak of a royalty, even when a relative of the higher royalties. They try to touch their clothing, hoping it would rub off on them, this magic from the blue bloods that have been appointed by God, you see. So nothing changes. So if you don't have that part of it, then you simply have the person who invented the doctrine, or who was a high priest of the doctrine, as in Marxism, etc. And they will worship them. And you always get psychopaths, and I don't care what kind of system is, psychopaths who gravitate around the people who are powerful, because they want to power as well, and money for themselves. So that's how it works. So if you start worshipping human beings, you're in trouble. Because psychopaths, it will be these particular human beings, and definitely the ones around them, they're going to be managing you. Very sad, isn't it? And it's no different what I'm talking about here so don't look for instant fixes in society. That's part of what I'm saying too, because you won't get it. Humans that rule over other peoples, I don't care what kind of system or democracy or fascism or communism, it's always the same types of people who run you. And if they're rather blatant themselves, blatantly nasty and power hungry, they simply employ those in academia. That's worldwide now. Whole levels of them in specialized areas, and pay them awfully well to do the running for them and to advise them. You see, that's how it's done. And you dress psychopaths up in nice suits. You don't put them into uniforms, military uniforms. That was for the 30s, that era. No, after that you put them in really nice suits and ties. And they're well groomed, and you might even give them basic elocution lessons if they have to give any talks to the public, or little quips. As long as they read their scripts, they're fine. Most of the things you get today are all through public relations experts. Most of the articles that you're given. And when you've got an official, like a politician, having to say something for a PR shot, it's already given the script. Even for a one-line sentence, it's not spontaneous. That's how fake everything is today. So getting back to, George Bernard Shaw declaring what socialism was, it was for a technocratically run society, an expertly run society. Everything would be ruled by experts for efficiency's sake. And science was be a big part of it. That's what you saw in Things to Come, in the movie version of Things to Come by H.G. Wells. You'd have the Freemasons of the air, the scientific elite would come across after this massively destructive war that had destroyed nations as such, till you had little city-states or towns doing their own things. And the Freemasons of the air and their super advanced military machines would then gas them all and take over the world and unify the world with themselves at the top, running it all scientifically. And their offspring would be doing exactly the same kind of thing, but under the guise of what they call progressive nature of the system. They would always advance science. That would be the pinnacle of everything, and whoever science dictated, those all the strata beneath them would have to go along with it. Bernard Shaw was more Bolshevik about it. Well, he said that. He says, we're not here to help you, meaning the peasantry. He says, because you could do what they tell you, you won't get food at all. And you have to work, by the way. They weren't in there for charity in communism. You had to work. No work, no food. So you had to work, and Shaw pretty well said the same kind of thing. So was H.G. Wells for the same kind of system. But Shaw was blatant about it, and there's that audio clip still out there yet, a little video clip actually, where he says, you'll have to come to us and explain why we should keep you alive. Because the only reason you would be alive in communism-socialism is to serve the state, the system. That's your purpose. Never changes. But they always need lots and lots of people to do the overthrows for them. It's quite fascinating if you've got time at all. I'm sure lots more folk are going to have time than more than ever before for a little while, as you're all locked down and they destroy the economy of the world, really, by locking us all down. That's the intention of it. That's the real intention behind it, to bring in the new system. So you're going through a revolution with science at the top, you see. And they're already showing, they've got revolutionaries out there for the streets. If you fail to obey them, they'll turn them on you see. And again, to heighten the fear amongst the general population. And it's not by accident at all. None of it's by accident at all. And none of it's independent of the whole big picture either. So, you're all being trained to demand help and save us, and you'll get your vaccination, and lots damage will happen because of. I've no doubt on that at all. Especially with, they're all pretty bad, especially when they're rushed through all kinds of, without any testing. And then the fudging of data is bad enough. The incredible fudging of data to try and get COVID deaths up by statistics, so that everybody who dies of anything is put down as COVID. And then that's not far-fetched. And by the way, for every one that they'll test, with faulty tests to begin with, that will come up positive, they'll attack about 50, at least 50 now, and it's all computer driven. Well, how many people would the average person meet in a week, or maybe 15, it spits out the computer. So they just tack that on anyway. It's just all bogus. But the intention, remember, is to bring in a new system, the Great Reset, the global Great Reset from the World Economic Forum, the masters. And you're going to get rationing. I've said that years ago. Their intention was eventually to bring in rationing, over 20 years ago. And here you are, you lead up to it. You can't go on and on. And people wonder where these tin cans come from, or the meat comes from, or their porridge comes from. You see, so it's all magic to most folk who live in the they're already under the thumb of the system, completely dependent on the system. You see, and that's what they want you to be, of course. And it's just starting. This is to last at least into all of next year, and maybe for 3 years. But the effects of it will never go away, because it's to be completely. They've said it at the World Economic Forum, and it really does match the stuff from George Bernard Shaw. You wait and see. You wait and see what they introduce. Right down from the climate activism and climate changes to the group of what they call themselves, the council that meets for the climate change. Same people who run the World Economic Forum at the top, who admitted that the folk were ignoring all their demands, that you live a different way and come into austerity, etc. Post-consumerist society. And living on the edge, that's what austerity is. So it's just, it's the poverty line. That's where they want to take you. Post-production, Post-consumerist, that comes next. And completely depend on their system for your very, very basic needs, That's what they want to bring in. So it goes along the way of the socialism, you see. Including their statements, quite fascinating to read them, of the redistribution of wealth, to make the people at the bottom join the revolution. And it's a big, big lie. Here's the richest folk who run and own now the world's wealth and its resources, pretending that they're going to redistribute. No, they're going to bring out the true technocracy forward, in a complete rationing system with conditions. Everything's got conditions of behavior and compliance. For everything you're told to do and comply with, you better do, or you won't get your little rationing or your universal basic income, etc., etc. I really mean, this is not speculation. They wrote about this in the 1940s. And Bertrand Russell, again, was one of them. He worked with all of the different groups as a member of the Macy Group, and he worked even with the Frankfurt School eventually. And he worked with under presidents and prime ministers to design a post-World War II culture for the public, leading to the changes, step by step, of, again, it's always the same thing, dissolution of the family unit, population reduction would come from that, and all other things too, which you're pretty well familiar with. Quite fascinating, really. And we're living through it now, though. It's not things to come, it's here. And you're seeing it unrolled. So yeah, the predictive programming is all around you. Horrific stories, terror stories, backed up by just figures and data and statistics, you see, that are all fudged to terrify, with behaviour screaming, 10,000 more cases today. Well, if they just unleashed another 50,000 tests in that area the day before or the week before or whatever, well, yeah, you'll get more coming up with faulty tests anyway. But the fact is, these are not folk in hospital or who are sick. If you understood how many viruses go through your system your whole life long, and through the entire population, some of them can sweep through in a matter of a few weeks, through the entire population. And you'll never know it, because no one's sick of them. That's quite normal. And this is the cons, again, back to conology, that's what they're doing. And you must participate in the con voluntarily. But you're doing it because they terrify you, so technically it's involuntarily. You've been petrified into compliance. And that's what they said they do. And with the SAGE groups and the subgroups that worked for them on behalf of the British government, and how they would step up the hype to get more and more fear to get compliance from the public. There you go, demanding that the media lie to you. The media doesn't need much persuasion, mind you, but when they're getting well paid for it, they're getting more funding now than they've had for years, because no one was reading newspapers and so on, and even looking at their sites for their news, because it's all nonsense and celebrities, you see. They're all getting big handouts and bailouts and funding, you see, as essential services to brainwash you and to lie to you on behalf of the masses, to try to get a uniform route of implementation that everyone's going to follow, you see. And again, isn't it so beautiful, the techniques that they've used? And it is. If you're looking at a movie with evil characters in the movie, you have no problem understanding what I'm talking about. But because, they can't all be so evil. Yes, they can. Humanity is very devious. Incredibly devious. And the people who are going to certain areas are more devious than anybody else. The higher up in governmental levels and corporation levels, all they do is sit and scheme how to get more and how to manipulate and how to take. And how to demolish competition all the time as well. The billions of dollars that go into all your intelligence agencies every year, billions and billions, multiple billions of dollars in every country, is to find ways to scheme and to lie and to deceive other nations and their own people by different techniques and so on, and by persuasion and lies and so on, so that those who own you can take more from you, or take more resources from countries. That's why they go to war with countries. It's all economic. Marx was right in that wars, the root of all the wars is economics. It's materialism. Stealing, we steal it because we want it. But for the public, you must demonize the people. That they're led by this terrible maniac over there who's nasty to his own people. And very simple propaganda. And the simpler the better. If it's too complex, you can pick it apart. So keep it simple. And Saddam Hussein was just a terribly bad man. He was killing thousands of his own people every year, So to save the people, we have to go over and starve them out initially with a total embargo, kill 500,000 of them that you're saving, right? Through the State Department. You all know who was in it at the time. It was all through the news. I did the talks years ago on the radio on it. But yes, 500,000 women and children alone were starved to death before they had the war start. And Madeleine Albright was questioned about that in a TV program. Did you think it was worth it, starving all those folk? Oh yes, I think it was worth it, she said. Well, there's a psychopath right there. You honestly can't really fit her into the category of human. I can't. Really, I can't. There was no trace of emotion or regret or nothing. No, same with Tony Blair. Asked if he'd do anything different again. Oh no, I wouldn't do anything differently at all. One of the biggest liars that brought Britain into the same kind of war. Yeah, this is total corrupt. We're living in total corruption. But again, it's chronology. We must comply with the corruption to make it work. We supply the troops for the wars. All young guys will believe what they're told. They can't believe they live in a monster country. Actually, that's changed since the advent of games, video games of all kinds. They've trained a whole generation not to think about rights and wrongs for the reasons you're killing and slaughtering people. You just want to go out there and rack up points to an extent. But before that, they had to really give you, this is why you're doing, and it would make sense to you. During the Cold War, lots of young folk would join the military, and they'd also go off and fight in different faraway lands, etc. A lot of them were believing in what they were told it was all for, or having faith at least that those above in your country had good reasons for doing it. And the sad part is the ones above you did have good reasons for doing it. They profited from it. That was a good reason from it, you see. It's sad, isn't it? But corruption in society is phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And it's shameless. They're shameless at the top in all the countries. And we do live in a more of a psychopathic era. And don't forget, psychopaths give you, when they rule your country, eventually, if they get what they want, was an atheistic population. Psychopaths have an awful time fighting, and so the communists, call it what you want, totalitarians, terrorists, they have a hard time try to fight those who are religious, so they have to slaughter all the religious, or ban them completely, because when the folk have something they believe in to stand up for, they're far more dedicated and willing and energized to overthrow tyranny than if they're atheists themselves. If they're atheists, they won't do it. So the atheists can be manipulated much more easily. But when psychopaths are in control, you see, they've eliminated all competition. Like the big idea theory, they're terrified of the big idea. In fact, they stole the big idea, like Bush Senior. He said that too. A big idea, he says, a new world order. And Mao Zedong said the same thing. Mao. The big idea was the only thing that made him afraid. At that time, he was talking of folk who had a real religious cause, because they're unstoppable when they get going, and they know this. So when psychopaths rule you totally in an atheistic society, they have no problem recruiting youngsters and paying them well, like mercenaries, to go off and slaughter. It's much easier to do it because they give you a psychopathic culture. That's one of the symptoms of the fact you're conquered, when they give you a psychopathic culture. And so folk who are not necessarily completely psychopaths will follow it too, and have a lot of the traits of them, but they're not truly psychopaths. And that's how we are today. Most folk who run up to the top worship the psychopathy success stories, and they want to get all those things too. But if they're not careful, especially they get on drugs and so on the way, which can blunt your emotions, you can definitely simulate very, very well the psychopathic personality, because their emotions definitely get blunted. I should really just mention, this as an afterthought too, for those who've been in the military for years, big pharma, have worked really closely with experimentations on those with PTSD. You've all read, I'm sure, the stories over the years of even trying to create a virus that would go into part of the brain to eradicate certain memories. This is what they hoped they could do by also using drugs, you see. And certain drugs they give to the high special forces, so they give it to them. I think Ativan was one, and some of the lorazepam types too, but Ativan was one of the favourite ones for some years. That literally would dull and flatten the emotional instincts of the person, the troops. And if they got the PTSD coming away from the military, coming out of the military, they'd put them on that too, to again try to flatten them, and it would everything they'd done would recede into a kind of la la land, but it would also blunt their emotions, and with relationships and everything, it would kind of